Greetings, everyone. Let me first introduce myself. I'm very honored and delighted to moderate this distinguished dialogue during this side event this afternoon. My name is Mary Falamaka. I work in the Pacific Island Forum mission here in Geneva. Let me welcome everyone to this dialogue, and I want to also thank everyone for your participation this afternoon. I want to especially thank the organizers of this event, the Geneva Environment Network, who made it possible for us to be here, as well as the co-sponsors, Bahamas, Barbados, Fiji, Guyana, Haiti, Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Singapore, and Vanuatu, and also to everyone else attending. This side event, addressing the adverse impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights, will focus on presenting the findings of the IPCC report, AR6 Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis, as well as on the possible future mechanisms to further analyze the interdependence between climate change and human rights. Following the qualification of the High Commissioner of Human Rights that climate change poses the greatest threat to human rights, it becomes most urgent to take action towards protecting human rights by fighting against climate change. Thus, taking into account the climate urgency faced and recalling operative paragraph 15 of the resolution on climate change passed during the HRC, which encourages us to continue the dialogue on this issue. So just to introduce the structure of this dialogue, first, we will hear from our panelists about the importance of human rights and climate change. Then during the second half of the event, the floor will be open to anyone who has questions or comments to the presented resolution. Today, I present you with our 5 panelists: Dr. Fred Flatto, President Mohamed Nasheed, His Excellency Eamon Gilmore, and Mr. Benjamin Schechter, as well as Ms. Melissa Gronig. Participants, let me introduce the 5 panelists again to you. Dr. Greg Flatto is the IPCC Vice Chair and also a Senior Research Scientist in Environment working at Canada's Climate Research Division. Dr. Flatto has great experience in the IPCC assessment program as the Vice Chair and as lead author for the Cryosphere chapter and coordinating lead author of the chapter on climate model evaluation. President Mohamed Nasheed, who's here at my left, was the Speaker of the legislative body of the Maldives, as well as the 4th President of the Maldives, setting an example with his environmental policies. He also is the founder and ambassador for Ambition of the ClimateVulnerable Forum, which constitute a global partnership of countries that are disproportionately affected by the consequences of global warming. His Excellency Eamon Gilmore, previously Mr. Gilmore has served in different departments of the Irish government as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. He now serves as the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, enhancing the EU's effectiveness, presence, and visibility in protecting and promoting human rights in the world. Mr. Benjamin Schechter is an Associate Human Rights Officer and the Coordinator for Environment and Climate for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. His work focuses on the human rights impacts of climate change, other forms of environmental degradation, and the resulting obligations of states. The last panelist, Ms. Melissa Gronig, is an attorney of the High Court of South Africa, specializing in environmental law. She is also part of Natural Justice as the program manager, where she focuses on supporting communities to stop fossil fuel projects, land grabs, and non-compliant extractives and infrastructure projects which harm the environment and violate the rights of indigenous and local communities. So there we have the 5 distinguished panelists presented to you. I am joined physically here in Geneva by 2 of our panelists, President Nasheed and Mr. Benjamin Schechter, and our 3 other panelists are joining us virtually online. So I will now invite our first panelist, Dr. Fred Flato of the IPPCC, to present the recent report. You have the floor, Dr. Flato.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here and speak to you today and provide you with an overview of some of the key findings from the IPCC 6th assessment report, the Working Group 1 contribution that was released on August 9th. This is the 6th in a long series of reports, and I'm sure that you're aware of those. If we go to the next slide, I'll give just a little indication. The Working Group 1 is the report that covers the physical climate science, and that's the report that was just released and the one that I've been involved in. There are 2 more reports that will be released early next year. The Working Group 2 report covers impacts and vulnerability to climate change. That will be released in February. And Working Group 3, which deals with mitigation actions and socioeconomic implications of climate change, will be released in March of next year. The Working Group 1 report looked at over 14,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications, and it does not do new research, but rather it assesses the research that has been done over the years since the last report. The last report was released in 2013, and summarizes that information and assesses the relative confidence that we have in results and provides information that is policy informative, but not policy prescriptive. It's a large group of people that work on this process for a couple of years. It goes through a very extensive and rigorous review process that involves both experts and governments and leads to these reports, which are very comprehensive and very highly regarded. One of the first and overarching conclusions from this report, namely that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, excuse me, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. And the next slide is one illustration of that. This figure shows that a time series of global mean surface air temperature, and it covers the last 2,000 years. You can see the years labeled across the bottom of the figure. The last little bit of that figure, the black part of the curve, shows the observed temperature from 1850 to 2020. So that's the observational record of temperature. Underlying that is the lighter colored line with shading around it, which is the reconstructed temperature over the last 2,000 years. And that's reconstructed from a number of different lines of evidence like tree ring data, sediment cores, various things like that. And what we can see is that the temperature level and the rate of increase that we have seen over the last century far exceeds anything that has been observed over the last 2,000 years. It is now above what is deemed the warmest multi-century period over more than 100,000 years. So you have to go back to prior to the last ice age to get temperatures that approach the value that we're seeing now. Now, there are many other indicators that show this unprecedented nature, but this is just one example of that. So if we go to the next slide, we understand why that temperature is changing. And the conclusion is that it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, are making extreme events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and more severe. And the next couple slides will give some examples of that. So if we go to the next one. This slide is an indication of one of the lines of evidence that allows us to make such a strong statement about the human influence on climate change. And this is a result that comes from comprehensive global climate models that simulate climate over the last 150 years, starting in 1850, And we can, with those models, do experiments. And one of the experiments that we can do is ask, what if there had only been natural forcings applied to the climate system? By natural forcings, I mean things like variations in solar output and variations in volcanic eruptions and so on. If we put that into the model, what we see, or into the collection of models, we get the blue line with its variability shown in shading. And that is basically no change over this time period. Whereas if we then add the greenhouse gases, land use change, and other changes that are attributable to human activities, we get the brown curve with its shading around it. And we can overlay the observed temperature, the one that was shown in the previous figure, as the black line. And we see that when we include the effects of human activities in these models, we reproduce the observed change very closely. And it is very clear that natural variability, natural climate forces like volcanic and solar changes can in no way explain that observed change in temperature. So if we go to the next slide, please. The change that we see is not just limited to the global mean, but rather many other quantities that are affecting change in every region on the Earth and in multiple ways. And those changes will continue to increase with further warming. If we go to the next slide, I'll show a couple illustrations of that. So this is a map now of temperature change. The upper center one is the observed change at 1 degree global warming. We're currently at about 1.1 degrees of global warming. And the map shows what we observe. If you take all of those observations from around the world, you see that the warming is larger over land than it is over ocean. And it's larger over the high latitudes, particularly the Arctic. The panel at the upper right shows the modeled change from the climate models that I just talked about briefly regarding the previous figure. And we see that these models are able to reproduce not only the change in global temperature, but also the spatial pattern. So those two figures look very much alike. And then if we look at what those models tell us about the future, at different levels of global warming across the bottom, at 1.5 degrees, at 2 degrees, and at 4 degrees, we see that that pattern continues, and it gets stronger and stronger as the global mean temperature gets larger. That pattern of more warming over land, more warming in the polar regions continues to increase. And along with that change in temperature, a number of other quantities change. And if we go to the next slide, please. This slide is a kind of schematic illustration of the change in hot extremes that go along with that temperature. So this is the kind of heat waves or extended periods of hot weather that go along with the increasing mean temperature. The little hexagons indicate regions of the world that are averaged together, and you can kind of see schematically the map of the world with North America and South America on the right, on the left rather, Eurasia, Africa in the center, and Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands on the right. So we've averaged things up over these different regions, and in all of those hexagons that are labeled with the region names, if there's an increase in hot extremes that has been observed, the hexagon is shaded in pink. If there's a decrease in hot extremes, it would be shaded in blue, but there are no places in the world where there's been a decrease in hot extremes. The little dots indicate our confidence in attributing those changes to human activities. Where there's 3 dots, it means we have very high confidence that human activities are directly responsible for the change in these hot extremes. So if we go to the next slide, we can do the same sort of thing for other extremes. And climate extremes are really the things that cause the most impact, the most damage, the highest risk for populations, for ecosystems, and so on. And different quantities affect different regions differently and cause more or less damage in different places. And here's an illustration that shows the change in heavy precipitation. So that is the heavy precipitation events that lead to severe flooding, for example. And in this case, when the hexagons are indicated in the dark green color, it means there has been an increase in these extreme heavy precipitation events that has been observed. Nowhere is there an observed decrease in heavy precipitation events, although there are a number of regions shaded in gray where there's simply not enough data or literature to make an assessment on this. Now, this is distinct from changes in average precipitation. There are a number of regions in the world that are experiencing less average precipitation, and that leads to more aridity, drier soil, more difficulty for growing crops and things like that. But many regions are simultaneously experiencing increases in the intensity and frequency of extreme precipitation events leading to flooding. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now looking to the future, the overarching message here is that unless there are immediate and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the main driver of the change that we've been talking about, then limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. If I go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit about the underlying evidence for that. What we do in this assessment report, as in past reports, is look at potential future scenarios or future pathways of greenhouse gas emissions and other changes, and ask what would the climate be like under these different pathways of emissions. And these are the pathways that were analyzed or assessed in detail in this report. They include pathways, the ones shown in blue, that have emissions. This is showing emissions of carbon dioxide over time from 2015 until 2100 in the future. And the blue ones are scenarios in which emissions decrease rapidly and reach zero and become even slightly negative for carbon dioxide before the end of the century. There's an intermediate scenario, the one shown in yellow, in which mitigation action is not really taken until later in the 21st century, excuse me. And then two scenarios shown in the red colors in which mitigations are unsuccessful in reducing emissions, but rather emissions continue to grow throughout the 21st century. And so we can look at the ramifications of those different scenarios and ask, what would the future climate be like under each of these pathways? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the first example of that, and that is the change in global mean surface air temperature. Just like the observed global mean temperature I showed in the first figure, this now shows future temperatures under these different scenarios. And what we can see is that only in those two blue scenarios, the ones that involve rapid emission reductions getting to zero before the end of the century, only in those scenarios are we able to limit temperature to below 2 degrees or roughly 1.5 degrees. In all of the other scenarios in which mitigation action is taken more slowly or is unsuccessful at reducing the increase in emissions, we see temperatures continuing to rise throughout the 21st century and reaching, in extreme cases, quite high levels. Now, that gives an indication that only by these rapid emission reductions would we be able to achieve stabilization of temperature and meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. If I go to the next slide, please. For temperature, as we saw, it is possible to stabilize temperature with rapid and aggressive mitigation action. But some of the changes that we've already seen and that will continue in the future are ones that are effectively irreversible. And if I go to the next slide, you'll see an example of that. This shows global mean sea level change relative to 1900 for those different scenarios. And you see that in all cases, sea level continues to rise. So even if we stabilize temperature, as is the case in those two blue scenarios there, sea level continues to rise throughout the 21st century and increases to levels above 0.5 meter and potentially higher by the end of the century and will continue on. So that's an issue that is particularly important for small island states. The fact that sea level, the deep ocean takes a long time to come into equilibrium with a new surface climate. So even if we stabilize surface temperatures at levels consistent with the Paris Agreement, as is the case in those two blue scenarios, The sea level continues to rise as the deep ocean continues to warm up and come into equilibrium with that warmer surface climate. In addition, additional water is continuing to be put into the ocean by the melting of large ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica as they also slowly come into equilibrium with that new climate. If I go to the next slide, you'll see that continues on, and the scale has had to be expanded here. So the little figure that's now on the left is the one that I showed on the previous slide, going out to the year 2100. The panel on the right is the values at the year 2300, so looking a couple of centuries further into the future. And we can see that even in those low scenarios that would lead to stabilization of temperature, sea level continues to rise, and by year 2300, that blue bar gives the potential range from something like a meter to around 3 meters. And it could be higher than that, depending on the emission scenario that's followed, and on the potential for additional ice to be released from Antarctica and Greenland. So that's the long-term potential and the kind of irreversible nature of changes that some of what we have already seen would contribute to. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, not all of the changes are irreversible. There are some slow components of the climate system, like sea level, like the ice sheets that would continue to change even after temperature is stabilized. But other quantities in the climate system are able to be slowed or stopped, the change stopped by limiting warming. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a couple examples of that. This is one showing September sea ice amount in the Arctic, well, kind of the summer minimum sea ice amount. As you all know, I'm sure it's been decreasing. The amount of sea ice in the Arctic has been decreasing year after year for several decades now. And in the future, we see the same presentation with these different future scenarios shown in the colored curves. The blue ones, in this case, those two scenarios in which temperature was stabilized at around 2 degrees or around 1.5 degrees. In that case, this sea ice loss is also stabilized, and the sea ice amount stabilizes as temperature stabilizes, albeit at a level that's much lower than the historical value of sea ice amount in the Arctic. Whereas in those higher scenarios, the ones in which temperature continued to rise over the 21st century, we see that the Arctic sea ice amount continues to decline, and essentially the Arctic becomes ice-free in the summertime in the future. If I go to the next figure, please, or next slide rather. This shows the change in ocean surface pH, which is a measure of ocean acidity. And we see that in those low scenarios, acidity also stabilizes when temperature stabilizes. We're not putting, in those scenarios, not putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which dissolves in the ocean and causes that acidification. So that stabilizes. But the scenarios in which emissions continue, in that case, the ocean continues to get more acidified, which is, of course, has important consequences for marine life. The next slide, please. So in order to limit global warming, strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in carbon dioxide, in methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. I provided just a little bit of information on that. There's, of course, much more in the report. And it's important to also note that reductions in these greenhouse gas emissions would also have consequences for improved air quality, as many of the air pollutants that are a cause of poor air quality and poor health in regions that experience poor air quality, those are things that are co-emitted with greenhouse gases. And so if you reduce those emissions, you have the extra benefit of improving air quality. And finally, what I just want to reiterate is a similar figure was shown in the previous IPCC assessment, and it illustrates this very close relationship between the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere, which is the scale across the bottom, and the temperature, the global mean temperature that is attained in the climate system. So that's a very nearly linear relationship. which really is an important policy relevant feature of the climate system, in that it tells us how much warming we will get for any cumulative amount of carbon dioxide emissions. It's important to note that carbon dioxide persists for a long time in the atmosphere, many centuries. So anything that's emitted into the atmosphere now, its effect remains for many hundreds of years. And that means that it's the cumulative total that determines the temperature that we reach. And a figure like this allows one to ask the question, if we want to stabilize temperature at a particular level, like 1.5 or 2 degrees, we can read across and then down and ask, what is the cumulative total carbon dioxide emissions that could be put into the atmosphere that would lead to that temperature, which means that no more than that cumulative amount could be emitted, else we would exceed that temperature target. And that allows for the calculation of what's called a carbon budget. That is the amount of carbon remaining that could be put into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and limit warming to certain levels. And that becomes an important underpinning scientific element to international climate policy discussion. So with that, I think the last slide is just one that, first of all, says thank you and provide some information on where you can find more information, particularly the website, the ipcc.ch website. From there, you can download the entire report or just the summary for policymakers, which is a relatively short document, some 20 some pages with some very nice illustrations aimed at a high level audience, and gives you the highlights that I described here and more. So with that, I'm happy to take further questions, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flatter, for that very rich presentation on the IPCC report. I will now turn to our next panelist, His Excellency President Mohammad Nasheed, to make his presentation to us.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Flamenca from the Marshall Islands. It's a pleasure for me to be here present in Geneva. I am here as the ambassador of the ClimateVulnerable Forum, now chaired by Prime Minister Hasina of Bangladesh. The forum is 48 countries now. We started in 2009 with a few countries. We have a manifesto, and part of it related to the Council and this session. As we all know, climate change is a human rights issue. How could it not be? After all, as the recent IPCC report makes clear, as we have been presented just now, climate change is already upon us. And many of the weather disasters that we see, from floods to wildfires to coral bleaching to typhoons, have been made much worse by climate change. A more extreme and unpredictable climate is directly threatening a number of fundamental rights. The right to life, the right to food, the right to a livelihood, the right to development, to name a few. I believe that the creation of a special repertoire on human rights and climate change is of utmost importance. I want to specifically focus on this issue in my remarks now. When you think about it, it is amazing that this position has not already been created. The need for it is so obvious. I think you may be aware or will hear it today. We have an important vote coming up on whether to establish this repertoire. I really hope that all countries vote in favor. I would be very disappointed to see anyone abstain or vote against. The Human Rights Council is designed to protect human rights. And climate change is the biggest threat to human rights this century. I think the Council would lose a lot of respect and credibility if it decides to ignore climate change and refuses to create a position of a repertoire. We need to protect our rights. In this regard, I am heartened that the European Union recently announced it would support the creation of a special repertoire. That is very welcome. I have no doubt that many of our friendly nations will understand our sentiments. So what might a special repertoire on human rights and climate change do? Coming from a climate vulnerable country, I believe the special repertoire could play an extremely useful role. Every time there is a big weather-related disaster, perhaps a typhoon, a flood, or a terrible coral bleaching event, the rapporteur could visit that country and issue a statement from the United Nations, which, if appropriate, could assign blame for the disaster. And some of that blame would surely go to the countries that have pumped the sky full of poisonous gases and continue to do so even when they know they are ruining the planet. Countries might be to blame for a climate disaster. For example, if they have not aligned their emission targets to 1.5 degrees. These are the countries responsible and culpable for the climate-induced tragedies happening elsewhere on the planet. And perhaps the countries who keep promising money to the poor, vulnerable countries for adaptation, and yet that money never seems to come, also share some of the blame. Especially if the damage caused by a weather event is made much worse because the vulnerable country was unable to protect itself. Of course, assigning blame is a tricky thing. Perhaps the giant flood was really caused by an authoritarian government cutting down all the forests. Or perhaps the tidal surge was made worse because a regime removed all the mangrove forests and turned them into prawn farms. Or perhaps because the regime dug up a marshland and had an airstrip on it. Or perhaps the government poured concrete all over the coral reefs, leaving them more vulnerable to rising temperatures. The special rapporteur would need to get to the bottom of this. There would be to have a look at the situation and see which factors caused the disaster. But I don't think this sort of analysis would be impossible. Special rapporteurs do this sort of analysis all the time. As some of you may know, as well as someone who talks a lot about climate change, I also talk a lot about the need for human rights and democracy. This has often got me into a lot of trouble in the Maldives, where I spent most of my 20s and 30s in and out of jail. In the dark days of our dictatorship in the Maldives, which lasted 30 years, the UN often sent a special rapporteur to have a look at what was going on, to assess the situation, and to assign blame. If I've been accused of terrorism, for example, and sent to prison, the UN would come and have a look. And the special rapporteur would see if I was really a terrorist, or if in fact I had simply called for democratic reform. The reports the UN special rapporteur issued were extremely important and helpful. They were the view of the respected UN office. When in the democracy movement, whose rights were being trampled on, used these reports as a way to pressure the regime to relent and allow for freedom and democracy. I see a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change doing similar things. They would protect human rights from abuse, protect the most vulnerable, who would gain a new advocate. Human rights abuse caused by the weather. They could assign blame, and their reports could be useful tools that people can use to pressure governments to mend their ways. Perhaps a government needs to spend their adaptation money in a better way. Perhaps another government needs to reduce its emission. If climate change is one of the biggest threats to human rights, climate action, therefore, must be one of the biggest opportunities to safeguard these rights. So let's see the creation of a special rapporteur as a positive thing, something that could help to unleash a new wave of climate change. Action on adaptation, and action on emission, and ultimately action on human rights. Who in their right mind would not want to support this? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I will now turn to our third panelist, His Excellency Eamon Gilmore. You have the floor, sir.
Madam Moderator, on behalf of the European Union, I want to thank the Marshall Islands for organising this very timely event, and I want to thank you for the invitation to join this very distinguished panel. Today's discussion is an important contribution to the work which is being done by the Human Rights Council to raise international awareness and understanding of the adverse impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights. There is no doubt but that we are in the middle of an unprecedented environmental crisis, with climate change affecting every region across the globe. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, climate change represents an existential threat to humanity. In Europe, we have witnessed devastating floods in several countries, including Belgium and Germany. Wildfires have ravaged the Mediterranean region in Greece, Italy, and elsewhere. And outside of Europe, Madagascar is suffering one of its worst droughts in 40 years. Earlier this year, flash floods and landslides devastated Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and wildfires scorched Algeria, and the list goes on. Last month's report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has just been summarised by Dr. Flatto, was unequivocal in its assertion that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land, with widespread changes occurring as a result. And this has serious implications for human rights. Climate change and environmental degradation have and will continue to have an adverse impact on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights, such as the right to life, to health, to safe drinking water and sanitation, to food, to adequate housing, and to standards of living, if it is not addressed. The European Union recognises this and has made climate change a central element in its external policy, including through climate diplomacy, by working with our global partners at bilateral level and multilateral level, including the United Nations and its Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also through climate finance, by providing financial support for climate action in developing countries. In fact, 30% of the total expenditure from the multi-annual financial framework between 2021 and 2027 and Next Generation EU will target climate-related projects, while a quarter of EU development assistance funds will be set aside to step up efforts on climate change. The EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy 2020 to 2024, which was unanimously adopted by our 27 member states at the end of last year, firmly establishes the EU's commitment to addressing the impact of environmental degradation and climate change on human rights. We know that environmental challenges exacerbate existing inequalities and discrimination within and between nations and generations. So one of the priority actions of the new action plan is to support measures to address the risk of environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and water scarcity on the exercise of human rights. Among other things, the EU will strengthen the link between human rights and the environment and raise awareness of the human rights impact of environmental degradation and climate change. We will support the role of public authorities in adopting and ensuring compliance with environmental regulations aimed at securing a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and we will facilitate universal access to safe drinking water and sanitation. The impact of climate change and on human rights has, of course, a knock-on effect on the people who work on human rights. And I want to talk about environmental human rights defenders in particular, because in 2020, 331 human rights defenders that we know of were killed, with 69% of those killed working on land, indigenous and environmental rights. These are the people who are working on the ground, on the front line, where the damage is being done to both the environment and to human rights. Human rights defenders, and women human rights defenders in particular, are at the heart of that inseparable relationship between the protection of the planet and the protection of human rights. There is already a growing backlash against women's rights in the world all over, as well as increased violence against women human rights defenders. They are especially at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. They suffer threats and are stigmatized, not just because they protect and defend the rights of others, but because they are women protecting and defending the rights of others. We have seen that this is further compounded when women defend environmental, land, or indigenous people's rights. According to reports, defenders working on these rights are nearly 3 times more likely to be assaulted than other human rights defenders. The European Union has committed through the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy and through the EU Gender Action Plan to a range of specific measures to support and protect human rights defenders, and in particular, women defenders and environmental defenders. Our delegation and our member states' embassies all over the world are active on a daily basis to protect human rights defenders through prison visits, trial monitoring, and meetings with defenders at risk, among many other actions. Since its launch in 2015, our main financial instrument supporting human rights defenders, which is called protectdefenders.eu, has supported almost 12,000 land and environmental rights and indigenous rights defenders. And these are now the main groups which are supported by this mechanism. And more than half of these are women. Why is this important? It is because human rights defenders are drivers of change who sound warnings before violations of abuse of human rights actually occur, and women human rights defenders and environmental human rights defenders are critical for ensuring justice, peace and equality. In conclusion, I want to respond to the comments just made by President Nasheed. And I want to recall that during the 47th session of this Council in June, the European Union stated, and I quote, that integrating human rights into our actions implies higher levels of ambition from all of us. It is only by doing so that we'll be able to fulfill our responsibilities towards our planet, present and future generations. To fulfill our responsibilities towards the planet and towards present and future generations, this means that it is now appropriate and timely to support calls for the appointment of a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. And I want to thank President Nasheed's earlier acknowledgement of the EU's support for this proposal. There is no alternative to stepping up our level of ambition, because failure is not an option. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much for that inspiring message, Excellency Gilmore. I will now turn to our fourth panelist, Mr. Benjamin Schechter from the Human Rights Office. You have the floor, Mr. Schechter.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Excellencies, friends, colleagues, since 2008, the Human Rights Council has issued a total of 11 resolutions focused solely on climate change, and numerous resolutions addressing related issues, including human rights and the environment. It's an honor to represent OHCHR on this distinguished panel with so many who have played a key role in addressing the human rights impacts of climate change at the Council and beyond. The work of the Council on Climate Change, including the mandated activities carried out by OHCHR, makes clear that the adverse effects of climate change have a range of implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights, including the rights to life, food, health, housing, self-determination, water and sanitation, work, and development. The reality of climate change and its current impacts are undeniable. The projections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, shared moments earlier, represent the best available science and demonstrate things will only get worse if we do not change our behavior now. And worse is not acceptable for people or for the planet. Consider just a few impacts. Extreme weather events contributed to internal displacement of an estimated 28 million people in 2018. Climate change could push 100 million more people into poverty by 2030. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths each year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress alone. These negative impacts of climate change and many others are disproportionately borne by persons and communities already in disadvantageous situations, owing to geography, poverty, gender, age, disability, cultural or ethnic background, among others. There are people suffering and even dying right now because of humanity's collective failure to prevent climate change. In recent years, the Council has explored this issue through a series of resolutions, panel discussions, and mandated reports addressing climate change and its impacts on the right to health, the rights of the child, the rights of migrants, the rights of women and girls, the rights of persons with disabilities, and the rights of older persons. The most recent climate change resolution, 47/24, focuses on climate change and its impacts on the rights of persons in vulnerable situations. At the opening of this 48th session of the Human Rights Council earlier this week, the High Commissioner for Human Rights dedicated her update to the Council to the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and nature loss. She emphasized that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is the foundation of human life, and environmental threats constitute the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. The resolutions and discussions of the Council, the work of its special procedures mechanisms, many of whom have issued dedicated reports on climate change, of the Universal Periodic Review, and of the human rights treaty bodies, demonstrate that human rights are impacted by climate change and also an important part of the solution to climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, every session of the Council represents a critical opportunity for states to more effectively address the human rights impacts of environmental harms, including climate change. This 48th session, with the stage set by the High Commissioner's remarks earlier this week, is no different. Like at each of the sessions before it, however, the clock is inching ever closer toward midnight. The need for more ambitious action is ever more urgent, and the challenges before us ever more certain. Fortunately, the work of and mandated by the Council to date offers a foundation for articulating and implementing a human rights-based approach to environmental action that can be strengthened. According to the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, global recognition of the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment could serve as a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and their improved implementation and enforcement, increased levels of public participation in environmental decision-making, and increased access to information and access to justice, leading to better outcomes for people and planet. These and other steps the Council may discuss and its mechanisms may take could address the triple planetary crisis, making an important difference for people whose lives and rights are most at risk from climate change and other environmental harms. At the direction of the Council, OHCHR has worked extensively to develop guidance for rights-based climate action. As a starting point, principles and standards derived from international human rights law, especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the core universal human rights treaties, should guide climate action, which should be fair, follow the science, respect the rights of future generations, and respond to the demands of people everywhere for action to save their livelihoods, communities, and homes. A human rights-based approach based on the principles of equity, accountability, inclusiveness, transparency, and equality and non-discrimination is both a legal and moral imperative and a practical necessity for effective climate action. Such an approach should include enhanced climate ambition, ensuring mitigation action that is consistent with the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, the goal of limiting global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the best available science. Participatory and gender responsive mitigation and adaptation focused on protecting and fulfilling the rights of all persons, particularly those most endangered by the negative impacts of climate change. Mobilization of adequate means of implementation in accord with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Operationalization of the human rights commitments in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. For example, by including guidelines for international cooperation mechanisms under Article 6 of the agreement that ensured meaningful and informed participation of rights holders, adequate environmental and social safeguards, and independent redress mechanisms. The meaningful and informed participation of all people in environmental decision-making and accountability for environmental harms, protection of environmental human rights defenders, and effective regulatory measures to protect against human rights harms caused by greenhouse gas emissions and hold businesses accountable for their climate impacts. Ladies and gentlemen, the coming years will affect the long-term survivability of our planet for all life as we know it. Today, across the world, key environmental actions and negotiations are being delayed by the COVID-19 crisis. In some cases, environmental protections are even being rolled back. Meanwhile, attacks against environmental human rights defenders continue to occur with impunity. According to Global Witness, 2020 was the worst year on record, with more than 4 environmental defenders killed on average each week. Failing to protect the environment and those who defend it is not an option. We can and must do more to recover better from this pandemic and to take ambitious human rights-based action to guarantee climate justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schechter, for your presentation this afternoon. I will now turn to our 5th and final panelist this afternoon, Ms. Melissa Genlich. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for this introduction and opportunity to address you all here today. I am an environmental lawyer at a Pan-African civil society organization called Natural Justice. It really is an honor to be here today representing civil society in this distinguished company. Thank you also to my fellow panelists for their contributions here today. During 2020, a number of regional consultations with civil society and indigenous peoples were held regarding this establishment of a mandate for a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. More than 150 organizations from across the world joined these consultations from more than 50 states. Natural Justice hosted one of these consultations in Africa. From these consultations, it was clear that there is strong support among civil society for this initiative, and this is across the globe, including those organizations active in environmental, climate justice, and human rights movements. The creation of the new special rapporteur has been a long-standing request by civil society. This dedicated mandate would enable the Human Rights Council to elevate its work on climate change in a systematic and sustainable way, would protect people from runaway climate change and its unavoidable impacts, and promote respect for human rights in climate responses. The mandate should specifically consider issues relating to equity and promote human rights-based climate action. This support for the new mandate is echoed by a joint letter from civil society organizations and indigenous peoples from June this year. It was signed by more than 500 organizations and academic institutions. Importantly, there is significant support from organizations working on the ground. In Africa, priorities include the need to address the issues of climate debt, and to amplify the voices of women, Indigenous people, and local communities, especially those affected by the adverse impacts of the commercial exploitation of natural resources, which is rife in Africa. Further, there is a strong need to focus on the protection of environmental defenders, and some of the panelists have already spoken to the necessity and the many issues surrounding environmental defenders. It is no different in Africa. Organizations have called for cooperation with regional institutions in Africa, given the continent's unique situation in terms of climate change. Globally, civil society has emphasized the importance of addressing the inadequate measures to combat climate change that have furthered inequalities, including the displacement, criminalization, and marginalization of communities most affected by climate change, such as Indigenous peoples and rural communities. The urgency of the need to take action to address climate change cannot be understated, the evidence for which has been clearly set out by Mr. Fleto in his earlier presentation. This cannot be emphasized enough. New and rapid climate action is needed, and it is needed now. Addressing the climate crisis is indeed a human rights imperative. Civil society organizations therefore welcome the strong leadership of the Marshall Islands and other countries to establish a new special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Gronik, for that short but sharp message that you have given us today. Now we'll go into our second part of the session, which is to open the floor to the participants. But first, let me thank all of our distinguished panelists this afternoon for their interventions. It has become even clearer that we truly are in a climate emergency, which requires concrete action to protect the human rights endangered by the impacts of climate change. This puts greater importance on emerging new climate policies as well as better green recovery. There have been repeated calls for the creation of special rapporteur, as we have heard this afternoon, to focus on the human rights impact following the effects of climate change. The small island developing states have, together with the countries of the ClimateVulnerable Forum and the Pacific Islands Forum, about 2 years ago, to call on the Council for the creation of such a post. This, in combination with the resolution passed in June on human rights and climate change, encourages an inclusive dialogue to be held on the human rights implications of climate change and the creation of a special rapporteur, whose task will be the assessment of these implications. It is now time to give the floor to all of the participants who are wishing to make comments or ask questions on this issue. Given the big number of participants that are linking in today, and I can see on the screen there are over 170 participants, it will be difficult perhaps to give the floor to everybody, so we will try and prioritize and give the first opportunity to states that are linking in. I will also like to take 2 to 3 questions at a time before our panelists respond to those questions. And participants, may I also ask that you make your interventions short and sharp, to the point, because we have only a couple of minutes for this intervention. So I thank you, and I will now open the floor. And as I open the floor, I see that the ambassador of the Marshall Islands, Ambassador Doreen de Broom, would like to take the floor. You have the floor, Ambassador de Broom.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, colleagues, friends. I would like to thank the panelists for highlighting so poignantly the existential threat that the climate change emergency is to mankind. Bearing in mind the urgency of climate change, such as expounded by the IPCC, the Marshall Islands has been pleading for the creation of a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights for 2 years now, ever since the 2019 COP25 in Madrid. Together with 14 SIDS and low-lying countries, the Marshall Islands reiterated the call at the Human Rights Council with its joint statement at the June session in 2020. In October 2020, the Pacific Islands Forum foreign ministers endorsed the establishment of the mandate in their Kainiki 2 declaration for urgent climate change action. Responding positively to the call and taking over the presidency of the CVF, Bangladesh echoed the call for the creation of the mandate on behalf of a group of over 55 states at the 46th session of the Council. With the momentum around climate action growing and Resolution 47/24 on climate change adopted earlier this year, a core group composed of Bahamas, the European Union, Fiji, Panama, Paraguay, Sudan, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands will be tabling a resolution focused on the technical delivery of the establishment of the mandate of a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. With the creation of this mandate, the core group aims to respond to the repeated calls made by countries particularly vulnerable to the threat of climate change, including 6 countries which are at the forefront of the climate existential crisis, and civil society, which has been calling for its creation for close to 10 years now. The purpose of the mandate can be summarized in 3 goals: identifying, studying, and raising awareness on the adverse impacts of climate change on the full enjoyment of all human rights. 2, provide guidance to states related to the adoption of human rights-based approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation policies. And 3, working closely with states to support national efforts while being attentive to country-specific challenges. The core group has been doing its utmost to ensure that aid duplication and overlap with other mandate holders is avoided, and is committed to reaching maximum consensus by engaging with all states and all stakeholders during informal consultations and bilaterals. The draft resolution will be shared tomorrow with the view to hold our informal starting this Friday from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. and the second one on the 22nd of September from 4:30 to 6 o'clock p.m. in the evening, and the third one on the 24th of September from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. We are looking forward to engaging with all of you and working together on an issue that is a common challenge to mankind. Komol Dada, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador de Broom. We hear that you have just announced the tabling very shortly of a resolution to call for the establishment of a special rapporteur and complements the calls that have been made by His Excellency Nasheed and also Excellency Gilmore during our their interventions this afternoon. I will now give the floor to Bahamas.
Thank you. The Bahamas welcomes the convening of the discussion and thanks the Marshall Islands for its leadership and Ambassador de Broom and her team for convening and organizing this sad event, of which the Bahamas is pleased to co-sponsor. High Commissioner Bachelet set the tone of the opening of this HRC session by making a clarion call for action on climate change by the Council when she referred to environmental threats as the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. We thank the IPCC for its work, including its recent report, which underscores once again that action on climate change is not only needed, but needed now. Part of the Human Rights Council's mandate is to respond properly to human rights emergencies, and today's event, therefore, could not be more timely as we are at the crossroads of an opportunity to ensure that the Council demonstrates its ability to rise to the occasion, to continue fulfilling its important mandate. It is for this reason that the Bahamas is pleased to be a member of the core group of countries supporting the call for a special rapporteur to address the issue of climate change. The topic is not only a relevant one for the Bahamas, but an urgent one which merits action by the international community. The Bahamas is under threat from sea level rise and has also seen how a single hurricane can erode in a matter of hours the development gains that we have made over the decades. For me personally, every time I hear a report of a country experiencing a hurricane, it brings back memories of hurricanes that I would have experienced, and also the devastation and the sense of hopelessness and helplessness that we as a country experienced when we heard the reports coming from the islands that were impacted by the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian. And so we understand firsthand that climate change has the potential to threaten the full enjoyment of rights in all spheres, from the rights to health, life, a healthy environment, and education, and the right to development. When history speaks of us, let it not be said that the Council did too little or that we did it too late. I have one question for our panelists this afternoon. What would you consider to be the most important added value that a dedicated special procedures mandate of the Human Rights Council on climate change would bring? I thank you.
Bahamas, and I think we've noted your question, and thank you for your intervention this afternoon. We'd like to take Haiti's intervention before we go to the panelists. Can we have Haiti, please?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The Haitian delegation thanks Marshall Island and Geneva Environment Network for organizing the site event that Haiti has the pleasure to be a co-sponsor. On behalf of the permanent mission of Haiti, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate everyone, especially the core group, for their hard work seeking resolution 47L19 on human rights and climate change that was adopted during the 47th session. According to our delegation, it is not only essential to keep climate change on the Council agenda, but also to keep raising public awareness about climate change's adverse effect on human rights. We welcome the work of the IPCC, especially the last report in which the worst prediction for the environment are presented. It is imperative that everyone put in greater effort to mitigate environmental risk of the planet. Our delegation will pay attention on how to implement the resolution L47 within its internal system and how it is contributing to the report of the High Commissioner that will be presented on the 50th session. As a small island, Haiti is highly affected by the impact of the climate change. And despite the challenges the country faces right now, our delegation will work with all its seeds partners and the international community to overcome the challenges of climate changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haiti, for that very important intervention. Before I turn to the next set of interventions, I'll now turn to the panelists for their response on the question that was posed by the Bahamas. What is the most important value-added aspect of having a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change? Very briefly, Excellency President Nasheed, then I'll turn to Excellency Gilmore, and then I'll invite the human rights representative, Mr. Schechter.
Thank you. Let's say there was a disaster in Bahamas, a climate-related disaster. Extreme weather created floods, or there was a typhoon that destroyed everything. And the special rapporteur then would visit the Bahamas, would make an assessment on why this has happened, who is hurt by it. It might very well be, of course, first to start with carbon emission, lack of adaptation funding. It also can be because of unplanned infrastructure building and development methods. Unplanned meaning destruction of nature, and therefore the impact on the land and the people was strong. It might very well also be because the country itself did not spend their adaptation money wisely. We feel that because of the frequent disasters now happening, it is important that the UN steps in and gives an assessment of what's going on. It's not happening now. There is UNEP, but UNEP is not doing this. That's not their mandate. There are many other institutions. The rapporteur might very well say that the country has to spend a lot of money on debt repayment. And with that, and also the money on adaptation is limited, and therefore they cannot defend themselves. So this analysis, I think, is now necessary, and we can use that to build better, and also to ask people to amend their ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I'll turn to Excellency Gilmore, please, for your views.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you, Ambassador, for the question. I think the impact is twofold. First of all, it is keeping the link between climate change and human rights firmly on the agenda through reports, through country visits, through reports to the Human Rights Council itself. And secondly, I think it is to make it clear that that link is not something general. It translates the link from the general to the particular, and that keeps at the forefront of our minds and of the minds of policymakers that climate change is not just something that is happening vaguely out there in the atmosphere, important and all as that is, that it is happening to people, and that it is happening in the here and now. And I think that the Special Rapporteur, I think, will play a very big role in bringing that to life and to light through the work that he or she will do. Thank
you. Views, please, on Bahamas question.
Sure, thank you very much. Let me start by saying whether or not to establish such a mechanism is a decision for member states and the council itself. And the power or value added of that potential mandate would rely a lot in the actual text establishing the mandate holder, the selection a mandate holder who can carry out the work effectively, and of course the office supporting that mandate holder. And I can say with confidence that the UN Human Rights Office will be there to support any action, increased action on human rights and climate change, and really looking forward to guidance from the Council about how we can take more effective action on climate change. And I'll just say a few words about what the tools available to a mandate holder are, because that again also is part of the added value of a mandate. And so those tools include country visits, thematic reports, technical assistance, providing direct technical assistance to governments and others who request it, engaging in advocacy and effective communications around the issue, and also receiving communications from persons affected by climate change and starting dialogues between states and people affected by climate change are all some of the things that a new mandate holder could do. And so I'll stop there and thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for that response. I will now ask Spain, followed by Poland, and then the USA. So Spain, representative of Spain, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Your Excellency. As panelists have described, millions of people around the world are already suffering the adverse effects of climate change, such as natural disasters and the exacerbation of inequalities. The climate crisis is also a human rights crisis, and the High Commissioner rightly pointed it out during her statement at the session of the Human Rights Council, when she stated that climate change is the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. Rights such as the right to life, to health, to food, to water and sanitation are threatened by the effects of climate change, and its impacts are felt most acutely by those in vulnerable situations such as women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and small island developing countries. Many voices have been urging the Human Rights Council to take decisive action to promote and protect human rights in the context of climate change. And the Marshall Islands has been pleading for the creation of a special rapporteur since COP25 celebrated in Madrid, in my country, as well as civil society has done so. My country is firmly committed to fight climate change. We do it nationally through the enactment of advanced legislation and within the EU, and through our cooperation and development programs, assisting our partners in their efforts to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. Therefore, my country firmly supports the creation of a special mandate on climate change and human rights, and rallies its forces as an EU member state within the core group. We must address the fight against climate change, aiming for the highest consensus around the establishment of the special mandate, and put the individual's rights at the center of our efforts. We owe it not only to present, but also to the future generations. Thank you very much.
I will go to Poland and then to the representative of the USA.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Let me also thank Madam Ambassador De Bruyn and her team for Marshall Islands Mission for organizing this important and timely event. I would like to express my gratitude to all the speakers, to all the panelists for their informative and thought-provoking interventions. These kind of events are necessary for the Council to better grasp different aspects of the nexus between the climate change and human rights. My intervention will be rather of a comment than a question. It is clear that the climate change poses an unprecedented challenge for the global community. As Dr. Flato stressed in his presentation, regardless of where we live, the effects of the climate change have already reached us. Unfortunately, more negative effects are still to come. And no one is immune to the damage the climate change causes, and there is no border that can stop this from spreading. This is a global challenge that requires a global response. The scale of negative effects of the climate change will depend on whether we manage to act rapidly and resolutely. The climate change has wide-reaching consequences for human rights. It is closely related to the right to life, the right to health, and many other human rights. Destroyed homes, ruined crops, heat waves that kill, just to name a few of many examples of how the climate change impacts our lives. That is why Poland believes that the human rights dimension of the climate change deserves a particular attention of the Human Rights Council. It is time to act. Hence, we would like to express our strong support for the creation of a mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. We hope that the new mandate will be supported by the whole Council and its member states. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative of Poland. We will go to the USA now before we go to the civil society, the Center for International Environmental Law. The US representative, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor. We would like to express our appreciation to the Marshall Islands and the other members of the core group for this initiative, and to the panelists for participating in today's event. The United States has long recognized that climate change affects the enjoyment of human rights, and that when states take action to address climate change, they should promote and respect their respective human rights obligations. Our ability to co-sponsor the resolution will, of course, depend on the text, and we will look forward to engaging in informal consultations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, US representative, for those very brief but important comments. I will now go to the CIEL, Center for International Environmental Law. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. We welcome the leadership of the Marshall Islands, Panama, Paraguay, Fiji, Sudan, Bahamas, and the EU to establish such a new mandate at this session of the Human Rights Council, but also the leadership of members of the ClimateVulnerable Forum who have worked to support this proposal over the past years. Civil society and indigenous people organizations have called for this establishment for more than 10 years. We're glad to see that meaningful steps are finally being taken. As Mrs. Groening has recalled, during the regional consultations we held with over 150 organizations across more than 50 countries over the globe, the message we got was very clear. A dedicated special rapporteur is needed to further look into the implications of climate change on the enjoyment of fundamental rights, promote equitable and inclusive climate action, provide advice on human rights-based climate action, and give a voice to the most vulnerable communities on the front lines of climate change. New special rapporteur would also be able to provide assistance and technical advice to states in crafting their climate policies, to build bridges across different states. As the latest IPCC report has shown, we must act now. There are no further excuses to delay action. The Council must take appropriate action as a matter of urgency, rarely behind the most vulnerable countries in the fight against climate change. We look forward to engaging constructively with states during the informal conference that have been announced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, representative of the CIEL. I would like now to invite the representative of the UK, the United Kingdom, before we go to the representative of the Thomson Reuters Foundation.
Moderator, thank you. The UK recognises the serious and unequivocal threat that climate change poses to our planet. As incoming COP26 president, the UK remains firm that states should fully respect, protect and promote human rights in all climate change related actions as recognised by the Paris Agreement. We are thankful to the Marshall Islands for their work on the creation of a special rapporteur on climate change. The UK recognises the importance of further scrutinising the impact of the enjoyment of climate change on human rights. With this in mind, we look forward to engaging in a fruitful discussion over this session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
United Kingdom, I will now turn to the Thomson Reuters Foundation representative, please.
Hi, this is Laurie Gehring from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to ask, President Nasheed gives an excellent example of how he sees this special rapporteur being used in practice. I was curious to hear other examples from representatives there of how they would see in practice this being used in their own countries on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I don't know whether you heard President Nasheed's answer, but I'll turn to our panelists for that response shortly. President Nasheed.
Well, thank you very much. I was using my own experience. As I mentioned, I've been in prison almost half my adult life. And every time I'm taken in there, the UN would send someone, have a look at the situation, make a report, and we were able to use that report for a lot of very good benefit. And similarly, now, when there is a disaster, the rapporteur can go to the country, make an assessment, and the report would be very helpful to build better and also to make good use of money. It would also will be helpful for those countries emitting too much carbon to understand the damage that they are doing to others.
Please go ahead, representative of the.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Excellency. Thank you very much, but I think we had a short interruption in the connection, so I don't know if it was only for us, but I think we lost you for a little while, so I was not aware that you were calling me. My apologies, and thank you so much, Excellency, for giving us the floor, and also really your deep appreciation for to all states who have expressed their support for an initiative that Franciscans International has been advocating for really more than 10 years. And so this is really important for us, and this is really a great moment for us to see that there is support and that we are taking very concrete steps towards the creation eventually of such a special report on climate change and human rights. And this ask from us is really grounded in the reality that our Franciscans partners and other partners on the ground are facing in their communities. FI is also being really actively involved in the broader movement of civil society, and you have heard from several colleagues, including Ms. Melissa running from the panel, who told about this request and this expectations from civil society. So I'm not coming back to that. But I think really for us and for many civil society colleagues, the issue of having a special rapporteur is really a matter of legitimacy for the Human Rights Council, as was said by a couple of panelists, I think, and other interventions. I think what it could bring also, in particular, beside everything that has been said already, is that a special rapporteur will go on country missions and will really be able to help in a very constructive manner, addressing specific country situations on the ground and helping in making sure that human rights are featured into policy making. And I will end with a parallel with what was said by the expert from the IPCC on the report. While there are some changes that are inevitable, irreversible, there are still things that we can do. And I think it's also the fact, it's also the case for human rights. We know that some people have will already be displaced, and this is something we cannot avoid, but at least we can make sure that their human rights are as much as possible respected and protected. So I think this is really something where the special rapporteur will really be of a great contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Franciscans. The first is from the representative of Ireland, followed by Sudan. This will be our last two interventions for this afternoon. The representative of Ireland, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And with that in mind, I will be quite brief. I just want to thank the Republic of the Marshall Islands and all of the colleagues for organizing the event today. I think it's very timely to have this event. particularly as the ambassador noted, that momentum is growing for greater attention and action. Just to say that, you know, small island developing states have long been the moral authority and voice for climate change globally, and it's no surprise that you're at the forefront again in driving action alongside your cross-regional partners. Ireland works very closely with SIDS and other partners on climate change issues in many multilateral fora, and we're happy to do likewise at the Human Rights Council. We welcome the proposal for the Special Rapporteur to establish on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, and we look forward to working with the core group to take this forward in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
We now have a request from Uruguay, and this would be perhaps our last speaker. Uruguay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I was having some technical issues, but I think now they're solved. I'm going to be brief. I just want to thank Geneva Environment Network for this important event and the distinguished panelists for their interventions. We just want to highlight that for us it's essential to make climate change a real priority in the Human Rights Council. We're ready to commit to negotiate with the Human Rights Council in funding formals and to promote the establishment of a new special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. We think that is a way, a correct way to make climate change a real priority, as I said. And also, we expect to adopt as soon as possible the right to environment. So we have two main issues that we need to develop further and continue the discussions, but take the decision as soon as possible, because as IPCC assessment has shown, we cannot delay more the action. Thank you very much.
It is an unpleasant task for me to bring this discussion to a close, the very rich discussions we've had this afternoon. But I'd like to thank you all, our participants, and also our distinguished panelists for your participation today. Today we have had a very important and rich discussion underlying the climate emergency and the threat it poses to human rights. We have heard overwhelming recognition of the need to address human rights and climate change. And also one concrete suggestion which has been announced today with the establishment of the core groups and its resolution. I therefore would like to invite participants to remain engaged. Some of you have pledged that you will continue to engage constructively and actively in the resolution once this is tabled in the coming informals. And lastly, the recording of this event will be put online where the discussions can also continue. So with these final concluding remarks, I should say that as moderator, it was my pleasure to moderate this very important discussion. And I'd like to thank you all and bid you goodbye. Thank you.